The clinking of faceted glasses in heavy metal holders is the main soundtrack of Soviet railways. Millions of passengers firmly believed that there was nothing tastier than the tea on the train. They believed it was about the journey's romance, the wheels' rhythmic clatter, and the special boiling water from the railcar boiler. But tea was just an excuse. The real secrets were hidden behind the closed door of the service compartment. An ordinary woman in a tight uniform jacket understood the real workings of the country better than any party official in Moscow. These carriage attendants ran an entire closed state on wheels, with its own laws, grey economy, and harsh ways of surviving within a system where they were paid mere pennies but expected to provide perfect service. Hello everyone, you're watching the History Show channel in the section How They Lived. I'm Semyon, and today we're diving into one of the main symbols of the Soviet era, straight into the open-plan sleeper car of a Soviet train. If you've ever traveled on such a train, you're probably feeling a wave of nostalgia right now. And if you haven't had the chance, don't worry. By the end of this episode, you'll absorb that vibe down to your bones, as they say nowadays. Well then, take your berths, we're setting off. The railroad was like the circulatory system of the USSR. To begin with, let's appreciate the scale of the railways during the Soviet era. The railway was the real circulatory system of a vast country stretching across 11 time zones and 9,000 kilometers from its western borders to the ocean. And there were basically no alternatives for the average citizen. Airplanes were more of an elite thing for party officials and the occasional business traveler. A personal car was a years-long dream, waiting endlessly in line for a Zhiguli. And intercity buses were only really suitable for short trips to the neighboring district center. Only the sound of train wheels remained. On average, in the 1960s, each Soviet person took about 5 or 6 long-distance trips per year. People traveled on business trips, took their children to relatives in the south, and rushed to the capital for sausage and scarce goods. This logistical machine's foundation was set when the transportation system was built. For a quarter of a century, from 1891 to 1916, the main line was carved through the taiga with shovels and pickaxes. And only then was the vast territory physically stitched together as one. The Soviet government upgraded and expanded this network. By the 1980s, annual passenger traffic topped 1 billion passengers per year. The whole country literally lived on trains, and each car had its own permanent leader. Who is a train attendant? The profession, the selection process, the reality. In the official staffing schedule of the Ministry of Railways, the title sounded boring, passenger carriage attendant, but in reality, it was absolute monarchy, on a small scale. For the entire trip, whether it was a quick overnight ride to Leningrad or a week-long marathon to Vladivostok, all the power inside the carriage belonged to her. Getting this job off the street wasn't that easy. Candidates were screened extremely carefully. Applicants were required to have a stack of impeccable references and a spotless record, but even that wasn't enough. The final check was always carried out by the KGB. There was also an unofficial looks test. For prestigious premium trains, they selected women who, by the standards of the time, looked like models. And for regular routes, they hired without any particular aesthetic requirements. The train attendants dressed according to strict regulations, which were more reminiscent of a military code. No loose hair or trendy hairstyles, only neatly gathered hair. Plus, a mandatory blue skirt and a thick uniform jacket. But behind the beautiful facade was exhausting hard work that the news never ran glowing segments about. The Moscow to Novosibirsk run meant 40 hours without proper sleep. The trip to Tashkent took almost 3 days. There was simply no rest schedule. You shared shifts with a partner, but all the responsibility stayed on your shoulders around the clock. Cleaning the toilets, dealing with drunk discharged soldiers, shoveling coal into the boiler, all done by hand. The workers themselves called their car a communal apartment on wheels. But if in a regular apartment the neighbors are always the same, here new residents with their own habits and quirks board at every major station. The official salary for this hellish work was a laughable 140 to 160 rubles in the late USSR. That's why the female conductors had to find ways to make extra money and monetize their position, which we'll talk about next. The hierarchy of train cars, a communal apartment on wheels. A train in the USSR can be seen as a perfect model of society with extremely rigid stratification. Look, at the very bottom of this food chain is the general carriage. On paper, it was supposed to have 81 seats. But in reality, the ticket office would uncontrollably print dummy tickets stamped as general. You buy this little slip of paper and you get the legal right to travel in pretty much any position imaginable. You can hang onto the handrail, you can nap on someone else's suitcase, or you can spend the whole night hugging the trash can in the vestibule. No one will say a word. Riding in a car like that costs next to nothing, so it was packed with the most diverse crowd. Students with guitars mixed with confused conscripts, tough men with clinking shopping bags, grannies with enormous sacks. That's how it happened that, for the official 8 to 10 seats, as many as 120 people would easily be crammed in. There was still only one bathroom. Well, you can do the math yourself. A step above was the open-plan sleeper car. Open compartments with 6 bunks each. No doors and no personal space. But at least you have a legal place to lie down. And by Soviet standards, that's already solid comfort. Then comes the compartment car. That's the local middle class. A closed space for 4 people, where you could safely tell political jokes. And at the top of the elite was the luxury carriage, also known as SV. 2-person compartments, crisp linens, and serious company. The price was exactly twice as high as the compartment car. An ordinary worker wouldn't even look in that direction. And this whole wandering crowd was hard for the carriage attendant to control. She was pulled around the most in the open carriage. Addressing her, "Hey girl," worked like a servant call button. Passengers pressed her non-stop. "It's drafty. Close it. Open it. When will we finally arrive?" The workers admitted that sometimes they really wanted to hang a sign around their neck. "The girl is gone. Only an angry lady in a jacket is left." But the regulations forbade it, and discipline in this bustling chaos was maintained by the thunderous voice of the carriage attendant, capable of drowning out the sound of the wheels, and in fact on the primal fear of that very voice itself. The system of norms, shortages, and the tea quota. And now about money. The Soviet economy worshipped fulfilling the plan, and the railway was no exception. Before each trip, carriage attendants were given a fixed allotment of food supplies. They were issued grams of loose tea, cubes of sugar, and packs of Jubilee cookies, the very hard ones that, if you wanted, you could use to hammer nails. A sales plan required meeting quotas for all supplies. Failing to do so meant losing your bonus. And back then, a bonus wasn't just an abstract certificate. It was real money for winter boots. That's why the train car marketing was extremely aggressive. A woman with a tray confidently walked down the corridor to the signature clinking of glass holders. 2 kopecks for plain hot water with tea leaves, 4 kopecks for the option with 2 pieces of sugar. They only gave out sugar cubes. Loose sugar would quickly vanish into pockets at the warehouse, but cubes could be somewhat tracked. But here the main problem arose. Tea leaves were given out just enough for the planned number of glasses without the slightest reserve for emergencies. And the overall shortage remained. Less tea could arrive at the warehouse and more people could cram into the train car. As a result, the drink turned out pale and watery. Passengers refused to buy the murky hot water. They could also file an angry complaint in the complaint book, and that guaranteed serious problems with the management. So they had to improvise on the spot. And the carriage attendants came up with a brilliant scheme. The secret is in the glass, baking soda, and the chemistry of Soviet tea. Passengers firmly believed that the train car and the tea had some kind of magical taste. They looked for the reason in the romance of travel, in the coal smoke from the railcar boiler, in the changing scenery outside the window. Many people still sigh, saying that in the past everything was made with care and now the recipe is lost. But in reality, the whole secret was something else. A pinch of regular baking soda from that very recognizable yellow and red box was added to the teapot. The whole trick was based on the basic school curriculum. You drop a slice of lemon into the cup, the acid reacts with the tannins, and the drink gets lighter. Soda, on the other hand, is an alkali and has the exact opposite effect. The liquid darkens instantly. Visually, it looks like there's a very strong brew in the glass, even though only a microscopic amount of tea leaves was actually used. There were actually 4 practical reasons for this trick. The first was pure economy. The saved grams of tea leaves would be used for the next round of brewing. The difference between the cash register and the actual consumption would quietly end up in someone's pocket. No one complained, since the color still looked right. The second reason was to soften the water. At the stations, the tanks were often filled with water that had a wild amount of calcium and magnesium. Soda would reduce the water's hardness. The taste really did become softer and more pleasant. That's where the legendary story about the special tea on the train comes from. Only the workers themselves appreciated the third advantage. After such a potion, the glasses were cleaned instantly. No stubborn brown rings on the glass. And the fourth bonus doubled as a kind of hidden medical aid. The typical travel diet of a Soviet person usually consisted of hard-boiled eggs, fatty chicken wrapped in foil, and salo. Stomachs would rebel, and a mild soda solution worked as the perfect antacid. It turns out that the train attendant also acted as the carriage nurse. They added the powder by eye, but it was an eye trained by years of practice. If you overdo it by even a gram, you'll get a chemical soapy aftertaste. No one printed instructions. The technique was passed on in whispers, from veterans to newcomers, and the method wasn't invented in the USSR at all. In the Himalayas, similar drinks have been consumed for centuries, and in Tajikistan, there's a traditional shirchoy tea with milk, salt, and soda. But the Soviet passenger wasn't thinking about Asia, he was just enjoying the service. Side incomes. The official salary, as I mentioned before, on the railway, inspired more sympathy than envy. That's why there was an unofficial under-the-table price list on the trains. All participants in the system knew the rules of the game. They just didn't discuss them publicly. The main goldmine was passengers without tickets. Hiding a stowaway in a packed common carriage is child's play. No inspector is going to count 100 bodies one by one. The standard fee was about 3 rubles. A tenth was given to the train chief for peace of mind. The rest was kept for themselves. Next came the earnings from that very tea. The pennies saved from skimping on tea leaves multiplied by hundreds of glasses per trip, and over a month, it added up to a pretty substantial bonus. Another source of income was running protection for the informal food vendors. Grandmothers with hot potatoes, belyashi, and pies were constantly roaming the train cars. The car attendant could easily put a stop to this business, but she preferred to turn a blind eye, sometimes out of the kindness of her heart, and sometimes for a cut of the sales or a free dinner. This grey scheme wasn't some kind of criminal anomaly. That's how the survival economy worked. The government paid pennies, and people made up the difference by whatever means they could. Logistics specialists of the shadow economy, but some players went far beyond pies and stowaways. Here the story goes beyond simple side earnings and turns into something new, a real crime thriller. Let's take the legendary Lviv-Riga route as an example. Under the guise of a regular passenger route, a non-stop pipeline was running. It was pumping tons of contraband and suitcase cash from one republic to another around the clock. Both regions complemented each other perfectly. Western Ukraine was producing the much-desired scarce goods in underground workshops. Leather, accessories, shoes, and knitwear were made from unaccounted raw materials right in the basements. The Baltic countries were the local branch of the West. People had money, different demands, and access to imports. Perfume, electronic components, and tapes with foreign music. In Lviv, you could easily get half an engineer's salary for one such tape. The railroad tightly connected these two worlds. An underground business of cosmic proportions flared up, which the security services tried to shut down for years. And the car attendants became the main couriers in this chain. The woman in uniform knew every detail of her territory down to the last screw. She knew where the plastic panel comes off, where the niche under the ceiling is empty. Any small goods traveled in perfect hiding places past even the strictest inspections. With one successful trip, you could make an amount several times greater than your annual salary. A business of this caliber needed reliable protection. A chain of bribes stretched throughout the entire station. Inspectors, station attendants, and the transport police all got their cut. Everyone understood. And during inspections, they always looked the other way. Security was ensured by a clever system of coded signals. A curtain drawn in a special way in the compartment window signaled an upcoming raid. The goods were instantly hidden or thrown out at full speed at a designated spot, where accomplices were already waiting in the bushes. By the 1980s, the assortment had changed. Fabric and shoes gave way to compact electronics and magnetic tape. The tape with Western hits was tightly wound onto reels and hidden inside rolls of industrial toilet paper. And when Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign hit, the underground adapted within a day. They started installing airtight tanks made of food-grade plastic in the empty spaces between the walls. The train rolled into Riga, hiding hundreds of liters of elite Carpathian moonshine in its paneling. It was a full-fledged parallel economy. Life on the road, what they ate, what it smelled like, and what they talked about. While thousands of illegal rubles moved within the walls, life in the carriage was bustling, forever etched in millions' memories. The signature smell hit your nose exactly half an hour after departure. A thick, powerful mix of chicken baked in foil, boiled eggs, and garlicky salo. The basic travel ration not open to any discussion. Why? Why is it always chicken? It was easy to get, and it could easily last a day without a fridge. And most importantly, with the sound of the wheels, it somehow gained a mystical, wonderful taste. Maybe the secret was eating the bird with your hands, right off a fresh issue of Pravda newspaper. The eggs were hard-boiled and taken by the dozen. Without the slightest crack in the shell, they lasted for 3 days. The sharp crack of an egg against the corner of the table was the second most important sound on the train after the clatter of the rails. Eating alone was considered a serious crime against society. If you took out a cucumber, offer it to your neighbor. You cut off a piece of salo, and the ice is broken right away. By the time you reach Penza, you're already best friends. And by morning, you already know whose son is serving where and whose cow gave birth to twins. The open-plan sleeper car worked like a free session of mass psychotherapy. People would bare their souls to complete strangers traveling with them. And the secret is simple. In a day, this person will get off at their station, and you'll never see them again. Guaranteed anonymity gave people the right to be completely honest. Taking off his jacket, a Soviet person would shed his social status. A professor, a worker, and a party official all slept on the same striped mattresses. The dining car continued to operate as usual. The prices were more than reasonable. A serving of rich cabbage soup cost about 60 kopecks. A cutlet with a side dish cost about a ruble. With an average salary of 130 rubles, it was quite affordable. But hardly anyone went there. Homemade food was still tastier. And besides, no one wanted to interrupt a heartfelt conversation halfway just for the dining car. Closer to night, the car attendant would appear in the aisle. Glasses would clink. The spoon tapped rhythmically against the glass. That cozy metallic chime worked better than any sleeping pill. Governments could change, the economy could fall apart, but tea on the train and the sound of the spoon remained eternal. The end of an era. What has disappeared and what remains? The Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, the total shortage of goods disappeared as well. The service compartment was filled with bland bagged tea, and the need for baking soda disappeared on its own. The tea bag was always brewed the same way, consistently and without any chemical tricks. The legendary Lviv-Riga route was cut by the new state borders. Shadow empires generated crazy amounts of money, and then crumbled to dust. The car attendants didn't disappear, but the profession became fundamentally different. Now there are scanners everywhere, electronic tickets, and digital databases. Hiding contraband in sealing compartments became pointless, since the shortage itself disappeared. The wild frenzy of the general seating car disappeared too. The open-plan sleeper car remained, but the magic of a random fellow traveler faded away completely. Now people sit in silence for days, glued to their smartphones. Yes, the heavy glass holders still clink, the wheels still clatter over the joints, but that closed world has completely dissolved into the past. A world where the strict carriage attendant would tinker with the tea to meet her quota, where forbidden goods traveled in the ventilation shafts, and where a green recruit would show a photo of his fiancée to a complete stranger, a woman in a blue skirt. I'm sure many of you have your own crazy or touching story from a Soviet train. Share them in the comments, I'd love to read them. Like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. See you in the next episode. Bye everyone.